Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's ParaBoss webinar. For those of you who haven't heard about ParaBoss, ParaBoss is Australia's resource for the control of worms, lice, flies, and ticks. And today we are going to be talking about integrated parasite management in cattle, keeping parasites and chemical resistance at bay. And in a moment, I will introduce you to our presenter, who is Bill Tranter. My name is Fiona MacArthur and I work for the ParaBoss Extension team. ParaBoss is a joint initiative of Australian Wool Innovation, Meat and Livestock Australia, the University of New England and Animal Health Australia. Just a little reminder that this webinar is recorded and we will have it up on our YouTube channel shortly after the presentation. There are two tabs which you will be able to use today, and that is the Q&A tab and the chat tab. So they have two different functions, and I'd really like you to use them in this way because I don't want to miss any of your engagement with us. The Q&A tab is only for questions that you want to ask Bill during question and answer time. So as you're going throughout the presentation and listening, if you have a question, type it straight into the Q&A tab and I will give it to Bill during Q&A time on your behalf. The chat tab is a little bit different, and it's if you need help from me throughout the presentation, pop it in chat and I'll get back to you in chat. You can do that privately. And that's really important because during Q&A time, I won't check the chat. So if you pop your questions in there, they might get missed and I don't want that to happen. So a couple of poll questions before we get started. Our first poll question is, what is your industry role? Cattle producer, advisor government, advisor non-government, education, which is student or educator or other, and where are you located? Queensland, New South Wales, ACT, Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia, the Northern Territory, Tasmania, or across our seas internationally. These questions are really helpful for us here at ParaBoss, so I thank you for filling out the polls quickly for us, but it will be quite helpful for Bill just before he begins his presentation to know what your role is in our industry and where you're from, so he can help tailor his presentation a little bit as he goes through to make sure he's really addressing what you need to know. So we've had nearly 80% of the audience has voted. So I'll just leave that open for a few more seconds, sorry, because I do have the votes still coming through. Okay, so I'll end that poll now and I'll share the results with you on screen. So we have 43% of attendees today are cattle producers, 4% advisors government, 36% advisors non-government, 4% education and 13% other. And where are you all from? We have 17% from Queensland, 53% from New South Wales and the ACT, 19% from Victoria, 4% from South Australia, 2% from over in WA, no one from the Northern Territory or overseas, and 4% from Tassie. So welcome everybody, no matter where you're from. It is absolutely lovely to have you here today. So I will just ask Bill to unmute himself and share his webcam and his screen for us. And while he's doing that, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about Bill in case you haven't met him before. Dr Bill Tranter is a veterinarian and he works up in the Atherton Tablelands, and he's going to give you a bit of an intro into where he's from shortly. His main focus for much of his career has been on cattle health and production services for both dairy and beef clients. He works up at the James Cook University. I was about to say Charles Cook University, but it's James Cook University up in Townsville, and he's a lecturer up there, training lots of undergrad veterinary students, both in Townsville and when they undertake core training in practice at Malanda Run, which is a beef breeding herd. And he's just informed me that we have quite a few of his students online today who are visiting from Hong Kong. So a very warm welcome to you all, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us. I have your screen up, Bill, so you're ready to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Hear me okay?
I can. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. And good morning or good afternoon or whatever it is, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all. We're going to discuss today a topic that's relevant to almost all cattle producers. We're going to concentrate on internal parasites. of cattle. And I think most of us have to deal with those at times. Just a little bit about where I'm from, just a little bit about where we're from. We work on the Atherton Tableland in far north Queensland, centred around the towns of Atherton, Malander and Ravenshoe. We also have practices way up on the tip of Cape York at Weipa, a mining town. It's about 700 kilometres north. We have practice in Charters Towers, 500 kilometres south, and on the coast of North Queensland. And you can see there we do a lot of work with the James Cook University Veterinary School in Townsville, and all final year students spend time in our practice. We work with cattle enterprises of all sizes. We do work with dairies on the Atherton Tableland here, and on the Atherton Tableland we have small beef breeding herds and fattening properties. The top picture on the right shows us cattle from some of the cattle stations to the west of us, and of course the picture at the bottom are our enthusiastic veterinary students who we spend a lot of time with as well. So when I'm working with students, I'm often talking about life cycles and answering their questions. When I'm talking with producers, they often have questions about treatments and things. But when I'm working with my own cattle, I have a small herd of 250 to 300 head of cattle. I have the same questions that most producers have. So many questions, and I'd like to discuss some of the questions that I have today, and maybe you have other questions, and as Fiona said, please put them in the Q&A so we can try and answer them if we can. But I ask myself at times, do my cattle need treating for worms at all? With external parasites, ticks and flies and lice and things, you can see if they're there and you can see if the treatment you've used has worked. But worms are a different story. They're inside, we can't see them, we don't even know if they're there most of the time, and we don't always know if our treatment has worked. So it's a fairly genuine question. What worms am I treating? Which of my cattle need treating? Do they all need treating or just some of them? What product should I use? Should I use a pour-on or an injectable or a drench? And are there advantages and disadvantages of each? I think lots of producers have these questions. Was the treatment I used effective? How often should I treat? At times, we might want to treat for external parasites at the same time as treating internals. Is there any known resistance to the product I intend to use? Some of the products aren't cheap, so I hope they work. How do I know if they're going to work? When I introduce cattle to my property, should I be treating them? I want to use the products responsibly. How can I use the products, or how should I use the products to prevent resistance developing? And are there any other ways to control worms besides drenching or injecting for worms? So many questions, genuine questions that I have, and I presume you would often have the same. I'm just reminded when I put these couple of pictures on the screen, those two pictures to me look like pretty healthy cattle, some fairly well-conditioned Simmental heifers there, about 18 months old, some Brahman heifers, I think they are a little bit older, but you'd have to agree they all look in pretty good order. And, I would think to myself, well, they probably don't have worms of any great degree, so they probably don't need treating. But I'm reminded of two incidents in the last little while that made me, puzzled me. I was on a property about a year ago treating some cows with eye conditions. And while I was there, they were Droughtmaster cows, big fat Droughtmaster cows, a little bit like these Brahman heifers here. And the owner was using a pour-on. And I said to him, I couldn't see any ticks or flies. I said, what are you treating for? He said, I don't know. I said, well, if you're treating for worms, those look like adult cattle in good condition. I'd be surprised if they need treatment. Oh, he said, I don't know about that. I'd like to give them a good clean out at least once every year. I thought, clean out? I said, I don't think that's so. They probably wouldn't have worms. Oh, yes, a good clean out's good for them. I thought, well, I'm not going to win this argument. But I did wonder to myself, well, I wonder if he'd be better off using dishwashing detergent if he wants to clean them out. And then a friend of mine, I was in the car just a week ago, and he said, I'm going home to put on some pour-on the cattle. And again, I said, what are you treating for? He said, I don't know. Don't see any ticks, but they've got a bit of fly on them and maybe they've got worms. I just want to give them a pour-on. And I wondered to myself whether we could do a little bit better than that. But the questions, here we've got a group of cattle. They look in pretty good order. The pastures are good. The calves are doing well. Do the calves on these cows need treating? That's a question I have. Now, I'm sharing a little bit of my own story today, more just to emphasise that I have the same questions that most producers would have. Is there a group of my young cattle at the moment, taken just 2 or 3 weeks ago? There's about 70 in the mob. There's a slight age range. The older ones are about 18 months and the younger ones are about 10 months. They've been weaned a couple of months. I asked myself, I wonder if they need treating for worms. Fairly genuine question. Anyway, before we answer those questions, I think we should do a little bit of revision. Some of you would be familiar with a little bit about the important parasites, but maybe others not so. So let's just talk about some of the common worms that are serious for cattle. There's a whole list that we could add to this list, but we're just going to concentrate on the main ones today. The roundworms are very common in pasture-fed cattle, of any grazing cattle. They live in the abomasum, the fourth stomach of the cow, or in the intestines. And of course, the lungworms live in the lungs. These are the adult worms. So the common ones, Haemonchus, the barber's poleworm, and Cuperia, the small intestinal worm. Haemonchus and Cuperia are the main parasites of New South Wales and Queensland, Northern Australia. There are different species of Cuperia. So there are Cuperia, small intestinal worms that are common in the temperate areas as well. Ostatagia, a serious brown stomach worm, a serious parasite of temperate areas, not so common in the northern areas. And some others, Trichostrongylus, Isophagostidum, the nodule worm. And of course, lungworm, Dictycolus, the lungworm, pops his head up from time to time, and the hookworm. We call all of these worms roundworms. So we want to talk a little bit about those. Then there's tapeworm. Tapeworm aren't regarded as being too serious. They look a bit ugly. Sometimes young cattle pass tapeworm segments, but we don't regard them as causing lots of trouble for cattle. And then there's the flukes. Liver fluke, serious parasite of temperate areas. Well, Victoria, anywhere where there's water, irrigation areas, right through New South Wales and into southern Queensland. And stomach flukes, more common along coastal Queensland. So we'll talk a little bit about these. And I want to just remind ourselves of the life cycle. So the roundworms to start with. All of those roundworms we mentioned have a similar sort of life cycle. The adults live in the stomach or the intestines, or with lungworms, they live in the lung. They lay eggs and the eggs are passed in the feces. And the larvae move short distance away from the fecal pads. And if there's enough moisture, they'll climb up the grass stems in that film of moisture, and there they can be eaten by the cattle as they come along to graze. Now, the larvae can survive for long periods at times, particularly depending on the temperature and the moisture. In very hot and dry conditions, they won't survive too well. But in moist conditions and coolish conditions, they can survive for many months. Sometimes when the dung pads in dry conditions, you know how the dung pads form a dry crust on top, the larvae can survive within those dung pads for many months as well and wait for a good drop of rain, 2 to 4 inches of rain over a couple of days to soften those fecal pads. And again, that softens the pad enough for the larvae to be able to migrate a short distance away from the fecal pad and up the grass stems ready to be eaten. And once those larvae are inside the cow or whatever age the animal, they'll find their way to their place of that they like, the abomasum stomach or the intestines, or in the case of lungworm, to the lungs. Now, the common ones that are serious, particularly in northern New South Wales and Queensland, other parts of New South Wales, the barber's poleworm. The barber's poleworm is large enough to be seen with the naked eye. It lives in the abomasum. Here we've got folds of the abomasum, the stomach wall quite inflamed and swollen with fluid. These worms have been stained a little bit, so they won't usually be quite as obvious as that, but you can see them with the naked eye. And again, those larvae are ingested and they develop into adults in the stomach, and common in the summer rainfall areas, and probably the most serious roundworm of northern regions. You can see that how big they are by the ruler. And they suck blood, and they, in serious infestations, they can cause anemia of the cattle. The top picture here on the right is meant to show that the gums and the are fairly pale. These worms are sucking blood. They're actually taking protein out of the blood, and so fluid leaks out of the blood vessels and accumulates in places like under the jaw. We can call that bottle jaw. So there are signs of serious infestation. And of course, they will cause ill thrift, weight loss, and weakness. Any animal with a heavy burden of any of these roundworms will have a poor appetite. They won't feel that hungry. It will be affecting their appetite. And so, and they're also using up some of the nutrients that the cow's eating. And in the case of the Barber's poleworm, they're sucking blood. So hence reduced production and serious weight losses, and it's serious enough to cause death at times. How will we diagnose we've got them? Well, it will depend a little bit on where we live. And when there's large numbers of adults, they'll be passing eggs in the feces, and we'll be able to see large numbers of eggs, like seen in the picture here. They'll be able to be seen under a microscope in the feces, and anything more than 150 to 200 eggs per gram of feces is regarded as is a serious burden, or certainly enough to warrant treatment. In more temperate areas, Ostatagia, the brown stomach worm, is a very serious pathogen. Living in the abomasum, similarly, larvae are ingested and develop into adults. And there's a lot of resistance to some of the worming treatments for Ostatagia. Some of the treatments we use don't work so well anymore. Most important parasite of temperate areas. And you can see here the nodules, the inflammation caused by the Ostatagia, the brown stomach worm. There's two syndromes that happen with these worms when young cattle, young beef cattle, young dairy cattle, ingest large numbers of larvae on the pasture, and the larvae develop into adults. They can cause serious loss of appetite and watery diarrhea, like you see in the picture here, and a rapid loss of weight, particularly in late winter and early spring. So it's very, very common. Large numbers of a group, most of the animals in the group affected. There is a syndrome, second syndrome that Ostatagia can cause. They're a little bit clever. They can burrow in, the larvae can burrow into the wall of the abomasum and sit there in a sort of a hibernated way for many months. And then some stage later, often during late summer or autumn, they can suddenly emerge and the larvae develop into adults, and we get a similar problem with weight loss, diarrhea and anemia. But now the cattle are a little bit older, maybe 18 months to 2 years, or even up to 3 years. And there may be not large numbers of larvae being ingested on the pasture, but these larvae have been sitting there for many months just waiting for an opportune time to emerge and develop into adults and cause problems. Then Cuperia, the small intestinal worm, probably the most common worm almost around Australia, with different species operating in the northern regions to the southern regions. But they can reach huge populations, 100,000 or more adult worms living in the intestine in just a short number of days, again by ingesting the larvae off the pasture. Very, very common throughout Australia, and probably the most common, certainly in Queensland and northern New South Wales. And there's a lot of resistance again to some of the anthelmintics that we use. Right, the lungworm. You should mention the lungworm. He pops his head up from time to time and can cause serious problems. The larvae are ingested just like all the other roundworms, and they get to the stomach, but then they migrate. They migrate through the vessels and find their way into the airways of the lung. And they like to, they can be large numbers of larvae in the right conditions, cool, high rainfall, coastal and tableland regions of eastern Australia. And the larvae can survive for a long time in cool, moist environments. So we get serious disease when there's when a large number of larvae are ingested in cattle that have no immunity. So I'll just mention that syndrome that we see from time to time. Well, here's, just before I do that, I'll just go over the life cycle again. The eggs are passed, they're coughed up in this case, and then swallowed and passed out. Well, in this case, the lungworm's slightly different in that the eggs actually hatch before they're passed, so the larvae appear in the feces already as soon as they're passed. They develop through the different stages, but they have a clever little way of getting spread a little bit further away from the dung pads. So the larvae actually hitchhike on the fungi that often grow in manure pats, the Pilobolus fungi that grows in manure pats, and the larvae hitchhike on those, and those fungi often explode and send their spores away from the fecal pads, and the larvae get carried away with those spores. And that's a way of projecting the larvae a little bit away from the fecal pads, because cattle don't like eating grass right close to feces. So it's a clever way to get away and then be ready there to be eaten. Here you can see adult lungworm living in the windpipe or the trachea of an animal. So the syndrome we see from time to time, when cattle come in to our cooler tableland areas, they're often cattle of 12 or 18 months old, Brahman cattle, but they've had no previous exposure to worms, and they come in and all of a sudden they're exposed to a large number of lungworm larvae. And as you can see, all those adults are developing into adults and living in the airways can cause significant problems, even loss of weight, lots of coughing, and even death, you can see there. And in the lungs, they will cause significant inflammation. Here's some pictures of some lungs from cattle that have died from lungworm infestations. The pink lungs up the top here is normal lung tissue with air coming in and out, but all the dark areas are areas of pneumonia. The lungs have become solid with inflammation. We call it consolidation, and so that'll be no longer available for air to come in and out. On this picture on the right, you can see again large areas of consolidation, not only in the bottom areas of the lungs, but also all through the lungs. You can see large areas of consolidation. So you can see these little fellows, these worms. Here's some adult worms in the lung tissue itself, and pulling them out, we've got large numbers in a jar here. So they can cause serious problems. But again, when there's large numbers of larvae eaten in cattle that have had no previous exposure, so they have no immunity. I should mention with the roundworms that cattle develop immunity. So lots of animals, by the time they're 12 to 18 months old, or maybe 15 to 18 months old, are developing significant resistance to the worms and are naturally becoming immune. And that will be the case with lungworm as well. But cattle that have never seen them before can suffer serious production losses. I'll mention briefly the serious worm, the liver fluke, that lives in the, or the liver fluke lives in the bile ducts of the liver of cattle. They have a life cycle that involves having to have an intermediate host or a particular snail. So without those snails being present, you can't have the cycle completed. So those snails live in waterways and wet areas and irrigation channels. And so we only see liver fluke in those parts of Australia where the worm exists. Here you can see some adult liver fluke, quite large, visible to the naked eye. And here's a section of liver that's been cut with some liver fluke moving out of the bile ducts. Here we've got some bile ducts that are very thickened because of the inflammation that caused by the liver fluke living in the bile ducts, and a lot of fibrous and even calcification around those bile ducts. So they're very thickened, and the liver fluke living within them and causing a lot of liver damage. Here's the life cycle. The adult liver fluke pass eggs again, lay eggs, and they're passed in the feces. The eggs hatch into these little, and they're these little squiggly things that can swim through water and penetrate through the skin of snails, the particular snail that carry these. They go through a stage of development within the snail, and then these little tadpoles escape from the snail and they climb up the grass stems and encyst there. This picture on the left shows lots of those small little metacercaria, they're called, but little cysts of liver fluke living on the grass or that plant leaf there. And the cattle come along and eat them. And then they migrate from the stomach through to the liver, where they set up camp and live in the bile ducts. So without the snail, we cannot have the liver fluke cycle. It's only occur where the snail lives. The stomach fluke is a little bit the same. He doesn't cause quite as much damage as the liver fluke. The young stages, they still have a life cycle that involves a particular snail. So there's different snail to what liver fluke need. But still those little cysts are eaten by the cattle, and then they develop into adults, and they live in the first and second stomach of the animal. So here we've got some grubby type things. You can see magnification up the top here, but these little grubs living in the stomach. And when they're migrating, they can cause damage, but the adults don't tend to do a lot of harm. But we sometimes see them when we open up a stomach. And you'll think, I wonder what those things are. Well, they're stomach flukes. So that's just a little run through the life cycles of some of the important parasites that cause significant production losses in cattle operations around Australia. Now, if you want more information, I should do a plug for ParaBoss. That's sponsoring today's webinar. A wonderful resource for all the information, all the questions you might have. You can just type in, go to the WormBoss or the ParaBoss website, and it has the different segments for worms, flies, lice, ticks. You go to the section that you're interested in. You can type in what species, whether you're interested in cattle or sheep or goats, what state you live in and what month of the year, and relevant information is there for you to access. So I find it a very valuable resource. Anyway, back to my questions. Can you help me? Do these young cattle that I had in the yard just a couple of weeks ago need treating? The youngest 10 months, the oldest 18 months. Should I just put a paw on them all just to be done with, just to clean them out? Or is that being irresponsible? You can see it's a little bit dry, but actually these cattle were on some irrigated tropical pastures, so they would have had the right conditions for worms. So how would we make a decision whether they need treating or not? So in my mind, some of the things that I would take into account. What do they look like? Are there any signs? Are they scouring at all? If I looked at their gums, would they be pale? Are there poor growth rates? But actually, when I look at those cattle, they look to be doing okay. Unless I weigh them, I wouldn't really be sure whether they're below target weight gains or not. They look okay. So I can't just tell by looking at them on one day whether they're achieving the weight gains that I'd like them to achieve. I look at their age and I'm reminded that immunity develops with age. So cattle develop a high level of immunity by 15 to 20 months of age, unless I'm talking about the brown stomach worm, Ostatagia, that can persist into 2 or 3 year old cattle, or liver fluke, who can persist into adulthood. But for the roundworms, most cattle are developing immunity. So maybe the older cattle in this group will be okay, but maybe not the young ones, because the other thing that I take into account, probably didn't need any treatment while they were suckling, but after weaning, a bit of a stressful time, a change of nutrition, increased ingestion of pasture because they're no longer getting any milk diet. That could be a time where I would give serious consideration to the perhaps that these cattle have serious worm burdens. Other things. Well, here we are. Let's have a closer look at the cattle. Up on the left here, the older cattle are in pretty good condition. I think that fellow in the front, I did weigh him, was about 500 kilos. So I thought, well, maybe you're developing immunity. Maybe you don't need treating. Some of the bigger ones did have some fecal staining around their back end. But I thought, well, there are an irrigated pasture, and maybe that's the reason. But the younger ones that hadn't been weaned that long, they looked just a little bit scruffy, and certainly dirty tails. So I'm reminded that when they were suckling on their mums, I've never had cause to think that the calves suckling their mums, they will be acquiring worm infections soon after they start nibbling on the grass there and picking up some larvae. But because they're on a high plane of nutrition, on a milk diet, the effects of parasitism are usually not significant before weaning, but worm burdens can increase after weaning. So I take that into account, all of those things. I'll also take into account the season. If they weren't on irrigated pasture and the conditions were fairly dry, I would think, well, there won't be too many larvae wandering out of those dung pats at the moment. If they did, they probably wouldn't survive the heat and the dry. So I'd be taking the season into account. And what part of Australia I live in. Am I in tropical, coastal, tropical regions, or I'm in temperate regions, or am I tableland regions? Because I know different parasites work at different regions. Just a reminder, in the temperate regions, the brown stomach worm, a serious roundworm, and Trichostrongylus cupurea, the intestinal worm, slightly different species, but very common in those temperate regions. Whereas I live in coastal North Queensland, so the parasites that we would be dealing with would be largely Barber's pole, other species of cupurea, and the nodule worm, and perhaps even Buanostinum. The liver fluke, we don't have the right snail, so we don't have liver fluke in our area. So I won't have to worry about that unless someone imported some cattle from an area, a wetter area, irrigation area, or an area where the liver fluke snail lived. But we would occasionally see stomach fluke, not that I'd know until I did post-mortem, because they don't cause too many issues. So I'm reminded of where I am. If I wasn't sure about that information, I could go to a very useful website called Worm Tracks. It's a website sponsored by Zoetis, and some of you might have looked at that. I typed in Worm Tracks into my browser, and up came this page, and it said, enter your postcode. So I entered my postcode, and immediately it came up and said, well, you're in tropical coastal Queensland, and of all the samples that Zoetis had collected over the years, fecal samples, and done worm egg counts, and did larval cultures to see which worms were operating, then this was the result. So I can see from my part of the world, a large proportion of worms would be cupurea and Barber's pole worm, maybe some nodule worm, but not many of the brown stomach worm or Trichostrongylus. Yeah. If I was in Western Australia, I typed in a postcode in Western Australia, southwestern Australia, and I still got evidence that there was large numbers of cupurea operating, but now a much higher proportion of that serious worm Ostatagia, the small brown stomach worm. So when I'm treating cattle there, I would be very conscious of what drugs to use and a little bit more conscious about the syndromes that Ostatagia has. So the treatment depends on all of those things. But then if I wanted to go a little bit further, what I would do occasionally is take some fecal samples from my own cattle and get a worm egg count done to see if there's significant numbers of worm eggs in the feces and see what worm burden I've got. And then what's valuable as well, if the laboratory will do a larval culture and tell me which species I've got, because some of the species like Barber's pole or Ostatagia do more damage and harm than others. So that's another way of deciding what to do. Here we've got some worm eggs under a microscope and they're being counted. There's different ways of doing worm egg counts these days. So I looked at these cattle that I had and I thought, I could treat them all. I could just treat the younger ones, the smaller ones, maybe the ones under 350 kilos. Or I could do my own little bit of research. It might be valuable for the future. So I took 15 fecal samples from the small ones and 15 from the bigger ones. To save a little bit of cost, rather than get the lab to do 15 tests, I said pool the samples. So they pooled the samples and did a count for the first 5 animals, the second 5 and the third 5. So of the younger ones, the first 5 animals averaged 480 eggs per gram. 1220, 540, but the whole group averaged 747 eggs per gram. And that's a significant number of eggs per gram. And quite rightly so, the lab's message was the need to drench was high. The older cattle, though, the first 10 animals had 0 eggs per gram, and the third group of 5 had 100 eggs per gram. So we would average those and say only 33 eggs per gram. And at that level, they probably don't really warrant treating. And that was consistent with what I thought, but I was able to validate that with my own little bit of getting a few samples. I haven't actually got the larval culture back from those animals because that was only 2 or 3 weeks ago. But a previous time I did this, I took some samples from 10 young weaners and a similar sort of result, 728 eggs per gram. And on the larval culture, the results came back that 75% of the worms were Haemonchus, Barber's pole, and 21% Cuperia, which surprised me a little bit because the proportion would usually be the other way around, but still very consistent with the types of worms that occur in our part of the world. And so we'll talk a little bit more about it, but I know that there's little resistance of these parasites, Haemonchus and Cuperia, to levamisole, the old treatment that's been around for 60 years. So I thought, well, I'll just drench them because there's plenty of information to say that Cuperia is widely resistant to most of the porons we use. So I use the old-time drench. Just a little bit about the treatment groups. There's different groups of drugs used for treating, but with cattle, we tend to divide them into the 3 main groups of cattle, of drenches. The white drenches, they're oral drenches. We don't tend to use them a lot anymore because people have forgotten how to drench cattle in Australia. They like porons because it's easy. And there's a bit of resistance to some of the white drenches. Then there's the clear drenches, which is where my levamisole that I use fitted in. It doesn't kill the eggs and it doesn't kill external parasites, so that's a bit of a downer, but very effective against the worms that occur in our region. And then there's all what we call the lamectins, all the MLs, the macrocyclic lactones. They can be given by injection or poron. They kill all stages of the worm cycle and the externals as well, persisting in the fatty tissue. And there's lots of them: ivermectin, abamectin, doramectin, eprinamectin, moxidectin. But they're used very, very widely since the wonderful technology of actually developing a drug that could be done was a poron. So now there's widespread resistance to some of these parasites, especially the Cuperia, that is one of the main ones that we have to use. So I wanted to know if after these cattle I treated, had my treatment worked, because I used an old-time drug, cheap. It only cost me 40 cents per head. If I'd used the poron, it would have been more like $4, or an injection would have been almost the same per head. And I took some samples 2 weeks after the treatment, and the results that just came back on just 2 days ago, and 0 eggs per gram. So that's been 100% effective. So I'll put that bit of information in my database in my head, and I'll use that. I'll keep on using that treatment, but I've done my check. Just a little bit to talk about resistance. Like with many bacteria and parasites, within any population, there'll always be worms that are genetically programmed to be resistant to any new drench. That's just how it works. Not every worm will be sensitive. When the proportion of resistant worms increase so that a treatment no longer works effectively, then resistance is said to exist. Frequent treatment is a strong selection tool for developing resistance, because you continually treat the susceptible worms and wipe them out, and you leave the ones that aren't susceptible, so the resistant worms become a bigger and bigger and bigger proportion of the population of worms that you're treating, and less susceptible. So what things contribute to resistance? Underdosing. Now that can be very common with poron treatments because animals lick each other. We can go to a lot of trouble to give the right dose, but turn the cattle out and then some lick each other and lick some dose off that one and get a bigger dose themselves. So underdosing, even when we try hard, especially with porons, can be a problem. As I said, frequent use of the same chemical or any chemical within the same chemical group. So if you've got resistance to ivermectin, there's a good chance that there'll be some resistance to moxidectin and doramectin in that same group of animals. Treating animals when there's not many larvae on the pasture and treating during dry weather is another contributor. Treating the whole mob. It would have been wise for me just to treat the young cattle and leave those bigger ones, because that leaves some cattle with low worm burdens, but we're not wiping out the non-resistant worms. Treating and moving to a new paddock, we used to say that. So on the new paddock, the only worms that would be reaching there would be the ones that survive the treatment and are resistant. So that's not ideal. Purchasing stock carrying resistant worms is another way. And one very common way, we use MLs, the mectins, often to control external parasites. And we're unintentionally exposing non-target parasites like worms inside to that treatment. So I was on a farm just a few hours ago, and they were talking about having treated their whole dairy herd with a mectin, because it was easy. Now, there was no intention to treat the worms, but unintentionally they're continually exposing any worms in those cattle to a treatment, and the only worms that'll be surviving are resistant ones. So this increases the resistance of all parasites. So the mectins are widely used for control of cattle ticks and flies, but they'll also be treating worms, and that's contributed to widespread resistance of Couperia, so that they don't work very well against a lot of our worms. So what should we do? Managing resistance. Avoid unnecessary drenching. In my mind, adult cattle should be immune. Avoid treating during dry periods, before or after moving on to very clean, low worm paddocks. Use the most effective drenches and rotate among the effective drench groups, but not just a different one within the same group. You're not really rotating when you're using just a different macrocyclic lactone, a different ML, or a different mectin, same. Use combination drenches. Some products now have 2 different chemicals from 2 different groups. That's highly efficacious and slows the development of resistance in the first place. Short-acting products are preferred. We used to think, oh, this is a good product that lasts a long time, will keep the worms off for many weeks or months. But over a period of time, the concentration of those drugs in the animal will be reducing, and the worms that are a little bit resistant will be able to survive when those treatment concentrations are getting lower. Always calibrate the equipment and dose to the heaviest animals in the mob. Periodically do a drench check test, see if they need drenching, and check to see if it's worked like I did. Have confidence that what you're using, it wasn't very difficult. Actually, the cost of doing those sampling, I did 3 lots of samples. The cost of doing that and treating with levamisole was cheaper than if I'd used the Poron on the whole lot of them. Where possible, use injections or oral drenches in preference to Porons. Treat introduced cattle with a product containing multiple actives, preferably by injection, so you don't bring any resistant worms onto your property. When treating for external parasites, use products that aren't active against worms, if possible. That might always be possible. In my case, I have a spray race, and for cattle I've got ticks, I spray with Amatraz or a product like that through a really good spray race, and I don't expose any of my cattle to a worm treatment when I'm treating for ticks. Are there any non-treatment control measures? Well, there's a few. They're not that easy, but this is where we talk about integrated parasite control. Pasture spelling and pasture rotation. But remember, many of these worm larvae can survive for many weeks or months. So for a lot of us, that's not that easy. Some places it might be. In our part of the world, we tend to rotationally graze, and cattle are in a paddock for a few days or a week, and then they come back there and they might be spelled for 3 weeks and they're back again. So you won't get much pasture spelling in that sort of rotation. If I had an operation that had sheep and cattle, I should have mentioned that the worm species that affect sheep are different to the worm species that affect cattle. So the Barber's poleworm that affects sheep is a different species to the Barber's poleworm that affects cattle. So if I have lots of sheep Barber's pole and I put my cattle in to that paddock after the sheep or before the sheep or whatever, they'll graze and eat a lot of the larvae that would have caused problems for the sheep, but they won't cause problems for the cattle. So that's a possibility. Getting rid of the pasture, well, may or may not be a good thing, but sometimes slashing, making hay or silage or cropping, that might be part of an operation. I like to put a little emphasis on promoting dung beetle populations. And I just mentioned just a little bit about dung beetles. You can see they're a species of dung beetle that I have on my property. There's a mum and a dad there. Quite a big dung beetle. There's quite a number of different species that operate on my property, but they're one of the bigger brands. And I'll just show you a couple of pictures from some dung beetles that we dug up just a couple of months ago. Here's mum and dad up here on the left. But I was fascinated when we dug down to see the dung beetles carrying the feces well down 10 to 20 centimetres. You can see all the dung being taken down deep into the ground, yeah? And deep down below, mum and dad have laid some eggs. You can see the little egg there. We could see that one with the naked eye. And then we came across another one where the larvae had attached deep down 10 to 20 centimetres below the surface, carrying that feces down into the ground, taking nutrients down from the feces underground, and so no longer available for worm larvae and flies and things to develop. So yeah, we're pretty keen to keep promoting dung beetles and we've done surveys of which dung beetles operate at different times of the year in our area. We know which ones are surviving and which ones, what months of the year that we don't have dung beetles operating. We'd love to get species that work throughout all the year. So there you are. That's a quick run through. Some others might have questions that I haven't touched today. If I just recap a little bit of some of the important principles I wanted to mention today. Remember, internal worm infestations are common in grazing cattle and definitely cause significant production losses. Young cattle, perhaps not suckling calves, but young cattle are at greater risk. Older cattle develop immunity. What control program for your property will be dependent on many of the things we talked about: where you live, what worm species, what season of the year. I just used my little cattle operation as an example as I work through questions and try and work out a plan for my own property. Sometimes doing it well, sometimes not. Avoid unnecessary treatment. Maybe I didn't need to treat the older ones in that group. Don't need to treat in dry conditions unless I'm using irrigated pasture. Avoid treating for worms when I'm actually really focused on treating for ticks. Remember that those fecal egg counts are a valuable tool. Put your hand in the rectum and get some feces. Put a cattle in a concrete yard and leave them there half an hour and go and pick up the feces off the ground. Or even sometimes out in the paddock. We want clean, fresh feces, but you might get those samples where cattle are camping. Use oral drenches and injectables in preference to pour-ons where possible. There'll be plenty of times where that's not possible. Plenty of times when I use a pour-on. I just try when I can to follow the principles. Products containing a combination of active ingredients are the most efficacious and will slow the development of resistance. So we're fortunate now we have a few brands of product that have a combination of the different ingredients. They'll cost a little bit more, but they'll be very efficacious. On the farm I was at this morning, where they were using pour-ons for all their adult cattle, I was pleased to see that he followed my advice that for all his younger cattle, he's using an injectable with a combination of 2 different chemical groups and probably seriously reducing the risk of developing resistance in those young cattle. But we've all got lots of questions, so seek advice, have a chat. I like to talk about these from your veterinarian or trusted advisor. And just a reminder that this website, ParaBoss, WormBoss, are a wonderful resource when you've got questions. Fiona, they might have more questions that I haven't touched.
Thanks, Bill. They certainly do. Our first question is from Luke, and it says, specifically in relation to quarantine yards, how far in radius from the dung pad will the larvae migrate? Would there be a need to double fence around quarantine yards for new arrivals while being quarantined or after being quarantined drenched?
I don't think the larvae migrate too far away from the dung pads. They do try to get away, the roundworms, and I said lungworm are a little bit better, but we're only talking, less than a metre, that's for sure. So not very far, but enough to try and get away from that contaminated. Cattle don't like eating around their dung pats, so we wouldn't have to get very far away from them. They only migrate a short distance, very short.
Thanks.
I don't think there'd be any need for double fencing or anything like that.
Next question's from Steve. This one comes up a lot, Steve, so good question. Do kangaroos and other feral animals pass on worms in their dung?
Do I know the answer to that question? Most of the species are particular to the species, like, as I said, sheep parasites don't affect cattle. Most of them. There might be, I'm not sure I can answer that well. We could find out for you, Matt Playford. No, I'm not sure I can answer that really well.
Matt's
but I don't think so.
Matt's online, so he might.
Yeah, Matt, you want to answer that question?
For me, Matt. Okay, next question from Olivia. Is there a way to test your mob or young stock to find out if they have been exposed and are immune?
Well, I think in my mind, the worm egg counts are really the way. Most of the roundworms really only take, 2 weeks to grow from larvae to adults, and they're laying eggs within 12 to 14 days of actually being eaten. So fairly quickly, if your animals have been exposed by the eggs in the feces, so a fecal sample from a number of animals to get a worm egg count. And then are they immune? Well, the answer will be if they've got no worm egg counts, they're likely to be fairly immune, although there is a little bit of evidence that older cattle may still have worms but aren't passing eggs very much. But in the main, we use our fecal egg counts to decide, if they have got burdens and if they're immune because they haven't, or at least they haven't been exposed, one or the other. We couldn't really tell whether they haven't been exposed or whether they've developed immunity and no longer have serious burdens. Thanks, I think the answer is fecal egg counts.
Matt replied back, liver fluke, yes, other worms, no, to that question. Yeah. Thanks, Matt, for joining in. Next question's from Rachel. How is it that adult cattle actually develop immunity, Bill?
Well, like all of us, we develop immunity. I'm not sure of the exact mechanics of how they develop immunity, but like all of us, we develop the ability to resist disease. So I don't know the exact physiological mechanisms. I just know they do. Matt, you want to answer that at all?
Next question from Leanne. Lactating cows or second calving heifers are as a group under stress. How does this influence their immunity to internal parasites?
Well, stress will affect their immune responses, and we always get disease. We always get disease when two things or one of two things happen. We get disease or the effects of these pathogens when they get large exposure or when the animal's resistance is lowered. So anytime the animal's resistance is lowered, which as your question indicated, first lactation heifers and second lactation cows will have periods of stress and reduced immunity, particularly around the time of calving. And that's probably got something to do with why with that brown stomach worm, they are a little bit more susceptible to worms into that early adult stage, particularly those ones that have encysted away in the wall of the abomasum. So they're under a little bit of stress and they're a little bit more susceptible. So definitely affected.
Thanks, Bill. Matt's just added in that obviously this happens after the immune response has been developed. As a result of that, it's reduced the number of worms developing to adults and therefore establishing, and also increases the expulsion of the established adult worms and reduces the egg-laying capacity of the established adult female worms.
So physiological mechanisms that do all that, just how it all happens, but the animals got a way of dealing with those parasites.
Okay. Is it true that where a low egg count in sheep reliably reflects their worm burden, this might not be the case for cattle and their worm burden could be higher. Sorry, let me just repeat that. Is it true that when there's a low worm egg count in sheep, that this reliably reflects that they have a low worm burden, and that it might not be the case for cattle? That they could have a low worm count, but potentially have a higher burden?
Well, I think we still wonder about that in adult cattle. They have very, very low worm egg counts. Some usually very, very low, almost impossible to count. But there have been some trials around the world where treatment has shown small milk production responses to treatment. And so we often wonder whether there's adult worms living there but aren't producing very many eggs. In this case, remember that it's the adults that lay the eggs, so you can have immature larvae and immature liver fluke doing a lot of damage, immature stomach fluke, immature lungworms that are doing a lot of damage but aren't producing eggs yet until they reach adulthood. Sometimes after treatment, we know that that's why we wait a couple of weeks after treatment before we do our check test, because treatment will definitely reduce egg laying, and we want to be sure that the adults, sometimes the adults have just stopped egg laying because of the treatment, but they actually haven't been killed. So there are different reasons why sometimes egg counts could be low and there's still worm burdens there. And I think that still applies to cattle as well as sheep. Matt might have something to add, but it's just that the worm egg count is our best way of measuring that we have, or the best and most easy way to do it.
Thanks, Bill. Last question I have at the moment is, can worms that have burrowed into the stomach wall during hibernation survive different drench types? Or can you create an issue by killing these worms burrowed in the gut wall and having dead worms causing gut damage?
Yeah, that's a good question. The mectins, the MLs, have been quite effective at killing many stages of the life cycle. So they have been fairly effective at dealing with these larvae that are being encysted away in the stomach wall. So with the brown stomach worm, that syndrome we call type 2 osteogiasis, where those larvae are suddenly released in 2- and 3-year-old cattle, that's not as common as it used to be because of the efficacy of those mectins. Yeah. But as we get resistance developing, it's just possible that that could be that problem could become more common again. But it's not as common as it used to be because those treatments have been effective against all stages. Whereas, for example, levamisole that I used isn't that effective against osteotagia and doesn't kill all stages of the parasites. So I think that it's affected by which product you're using. Not to my knowledge, does killing them cause big issues? Like in dogs, when you have heartworm and you kill a lot of heartworm all at once, you can have serious issues with trying to get rid of all those worms. But I'm not aware of any issues associated with treating brown stomach worm.
Thanks, Bill. Another question's just come through. In the wet tropics during, obviously, the wet season, where you get prolific grass growth, cattle often don't put on much weight compared to in somewhat drier times, so less substance to the grass. Is it possible that internal parasites are a likely contributor to this lack of weight gain?
Well, again, I said if it was young cattle, definitely. But as cattle are developing immunity, there's lots of other reasons why those pastures might be, they're growing very quickly, they're producing a lot of fibre, they're getting very stemmy. So the quality of those pastures, or the quality, there's a lot of fibre in them and less leaf. And so they look pretty good because there's a lot of it. But actually, from a nutritional point of view, all that fibre fills up their stomachs and reduces the amount that they can eat of it, as opposed to temperate pastures. So there are other reasons besides worms why cattle during those wetter times may not do quite as well as what you'd think they should.
Thanks, Bill. We're getting some great questions through today.
Yeah, great questions.
Got another good one here from Jacob. Will we get to a point where we can start using the drenches that worms are resistant to once they have been out of our treatment program for long enough? Or will we always need to find new ones and new combinations?
Well, I think once they've developed resistance, they're stuck with it. An example I would use, this was with ticks rather than the worms, but we periodically do collect ticks to see what chemicals there are. We'll work on them. And so I've done a survey of my own clients, and I've taken ticks from biodynamic properties who haven't used any chemicals for 30 years and found the same level of resistance to the chemicals that everyone else has. So I would think a little hope for that. I also would be worried about always having new chemicals and remembering that each of our chemical groups, it's only taken 5, 7, or I don't know, 8 or 9 years of the information's around before resistance started appearing. So just hoping that there'll always be a new chemical is not really, I'm not that optimistic about that. But I do know that when we use chemicals, 2 or 3 from different chemical groups, they're acting very differently on the parasites. One may not work effectively, the second one will. So that's using combination products is the most effective way.
Thanks, Bill. Matt says that he agrees as well. So that is the end of our question time. Thanks, Matt, for joining in. It was great to have you online virtually there. And I will just swap back over to my screen. One moment. Here we go. So just a couple of closing slides here. We'll have a follow-up survey. The link will be posted. It will come up straight away after this in your, on your internet. If it doesn't, the email, and it will be emailed out tomorrow. There are 5 short answers, and I thank you in advance for filling it in. I had very touchy emails this afternoon. So thanks very much, Bill, for joining us today. It was wonderful to have you online and great to have so many registrations to round out our webinar season for the year.
Thank you, Fiona.
And that's it from us here at ParaBoss today. So thank you from our whole team here at ParaBoss for supporting our webinar series throughout 2022. We have been privileged to have some wonderful speakers on across many different topics, and it's been wonderful to have everybody's support. So I'd like to take the opportunity to wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, even though we haven't quite got to December yet. And our thoughts go out to all of the producers that are having problems at the moment with all the floodwaters. So please stay safe and look after each other. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks, Fiona. Thanks, everyone.